All right, today we're jumping right into the thick of it, the controversy swirling around the Trump administration's Department of Justice and how it handled the Jeffrey Epstein files. We're going to break down some really serious claims from source material that scrutinized their every move. So let's get into it.
You know, it all really comes down to this one totally baffling question. You have files on one of the most infamous criminals of our time, released by the government, and then poof, some of them just vanish from the official website. So what on earth does the source material claim happened here?
So the story really kicks off with something called the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Now, this law was supposed to be a big deal, to pull back the curtain and make the DOJ release its records on the case. Everyone was expecting a flood of information, of transparency. But, according to the analysis we're looking at, what we got instead was just total confusion, right from the start.
I mean, right out of the gate, the source says this whole thing was a mess. We're talking about files going up online and then just being taken down. Hundreds of pages completely blacked out. They even say old photos, stuff that was already out there, were being passed off as if it was brand new evidence. And, on top of all that, they missed the legal deadline to get it all out.
But in the middle of all that chaos, one thing really stood out: the disappearance of a single photo. It was labeled Image 468, and it reportedly showed Donald and Melania Trump with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, its disappearance was such a big deal, the source notes, that House Oversight Democrats actually flagged it publicly and started demanding answers.
Okay, so you've got documents vanishing and pages that look like they've been attacked with a Sharpie. What was the official line from the Trump DOJ? What was their reason for all this?
Well, here's the official explanation from the Deputy Attorney General at the time, Todd Blanch. And it was pretty straightforward. It was all about protecting the victims. The argument was, look, the law requires us to be careful, to go through everything and make sure that no sensitive information about the survivors gets out there.
But, and this is a big but, the source material we're digging into takes that official reason and puts it right under the microscope. And it basically argues that when you look at the evidence, that story doesn't quite hold up.
And Exhibit A for their case? Documents that look just like this. Just imagine getting a file that's 100 pages long and every single page is just a solid black box. The analysis basically asks, is this really about protecting victims' names? Or is this about hiding, well, everything?
The source makes a few crucial points here. First, a judge had already said these documents should be unsealed. Second, the law itself is super clear. You can't black things out just because they might be politically embarrassing. And then, in just a gut-wrenching twist of irony, the source claims that in all this rush to redact everything, the DOJ actually messed up and accidentally exposed a victim's name, the very thing they said they were trying to prevent.
Then the analysis points to a contrast that it finds pretty disturbing. On one hand, you have Ghislaine Maxwell. The source claims she got a personal interview in prison with the deputy AG himself and was later moved to a lower security prison. But on the other hand, the actual survivors of the trafficking ring, the source alleges they weren't spoken to directly. Instead, the DOJ talked to a generic victims' rights group. And as you can imagine, the survivors were reportedly outraged by all of this.
So when you put all these pieces together, the source material arrives at its central and, let's be honest, most explosive allegation. It argues this wasn't about incompetence or even just about protecting victims, but something else entirely.
And there it is, the core argument, stated as plainly as possible. The source material's main claim is that the real reason for the redactions, the disappearing files, and all the confusing explanations was to protect then-President Donald Trump.
Now, to build this case, the source lays out a timeline of what it claims was Trump's changing position. It points to him first saying he'd release the files, then, once in office, using delaying tactics, getting angry with reporters asking about it, and even allegedly pressuring his allies to just stop talking about the case. And finally, signing the transparency law, but doing it quietly after his party failed to block it.
Yeah, the analysis also gets ahead of a common question. Well, what about Biden? Why didn't his administration just release everything? The source offers a few counterarguments. First, Trump campaigned on this, Biden didn't. Second, the DOJ is supposed to be independent from the president. And third, the files were still tied up in Ghislaine Maxwell's ongoing case. And then it flips the question back around, asking why Trump didn't just release them himself after Maxwell was convicted.
And to really hammer home that alleged personal connection, the source highlights this quote. This is what Donald Trump said after Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested. That comment, "I wish her well," became a huge talking point, and the source uses it to frame the DOJ's alleged motives.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a minute.
Because the source argues that these specific actions aren't just about one case. They claim it all connects back to a much bigger, much more controversial idea about how the presidency is supposed to work.
It's called the unitary executive theory. The way the source explains it, it's the idea that the entire executive branch, we're talking the FBI, the CIA, and, yes, the Department of Justice, they don't really have independence. They all ultimately exist to serve the will of one person, the president.
And this, according to the source, is how it all clicks into place. They argue that if you look at the DOJ's actions through that lens, their business model, as they call it, becomes crystal clear. Their number one job wasn't impartial justice, it was protecting the president, period.
And all of this leaves us with one final massive question. Because what happened with the Epstein files, as laid out in the source material, really forces a tough conversation. When the public's right to know goes head-to-head with the government's claim that it's protecting people, who actually gets to draw that line? And how can any of us be sure that power isn't just being used to protect